So first, I want to welcome everyone to this event, this Digital Africa Now, that we have called African Perspectives on European Migration Policies. We are very happy with the panel that we have today. It's a very knowledgeable and good panel that will answer all the questions we have about European migration policies and their effects on African countries. My name is Hilde Hundevatn, and I work for the Norwegian Council for Africa. This digital event is a part of the monthly seminar where we discuss important and relevant issues taking place on the continent. And if you don't follow us on Facebook already, please do. And also, when you are leaving the meeting, a small questionnaire that takes about 30 seconds to fill out will pop up. Please help us fill out this questionnaire. It will help us improve our work. And then lastly, there will also be time for questions from you in the audience. So if you come up with any questions as you hear the presentations from the panel, please just use the Q&A function or write them in the chat. And then we'll get back to that after the presentations and the panel discussions. I just wanted to give you a short introduction at the topic at hand, because when I was Googling African migration to find a picture I could use for the event, all the pictures that came up were these pictures of boats filled with people trying to cross the Mediterranean, some horrible pictures as well. And of course, this is also a part of African migration, but it's just a small part. But it seems that this is what African migration has come to look like for European countries, a crisis to be solved. Because actually, when you look at the facts, 80% of the migration going on from African countries is to another African country. And in Africa, the regional economic integration has been taking place forever. And for many countries, people moved long distances, even whole communities moving from one location to another as a refugee from hardship or war or looking for new possibilities. And while reflection on migration started in the African Union in the 1990s with a question of how they could kind of harness what they saw as an opportunity, reflection on migration in the EU started almost a decade later with a question of how to manage what they saw as a problem. And while migration was regarded as merely a part of the development cooperation between the EU and African countries earlier, this seems to have shifted in 2015 when we had the so-called refugee crisis in the EU. So in the eyes of the EU, it seems migration and the migration the future of instead of having a focus on development cooperation, the migration took kind of went in the front seat, and everything is about handling the migration crisis as they see it. And it has grown in the eyes of the EU, it can seem, from what is a manageable problem to a crisis that has to be solved. So what does all this mean for African countries? What strategies do they use? Is it possible for African countries and the EU to have a sustainable collaboration about these issues? These are all the questions that our panel will hopefully help us discuss today. And the first one to give you a presentation is Otilia Anna Magna-Gidse, head of the special projects in the office of the executive director at the Institute for Security Studies. And one of her focus areas is migration trends and policy. And she has written several pieces on migration, Africa and Europe, and how to build a consensus. And then I think it's important for you to know, I'm happy we can see you now, Otilia, but she's in South Africa and they are experiencing these rolling blackouts, meaning that her internet is a bit unstable and she might lose connection or disconnect the video to try to be able to just have the sound. Then we have, after Ottilia, we have Mehari Tadele Maru, who is a professor at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies and School of Transnational Governance. Maru has previously worked as a program coordinator for the African Union Migration Program, and he was also the Africa expert member for the review of the Africa-EU Partnership on Migration, Mobility and Employment. In Bergen, we have Katrine Tallerås, who's a researcher at Christian Michelsen's Institute and a senior researcher at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo. Tallerås is currently working on projects related to migration, transnational living and migration management, and she's the leader of the project Effects of Externalization, EU Migration Management in Africa and the Middle East. And then we have Luisa Faustini Torres, who holds a PhD in Political and Social Sciences from the Universitat Pompeu Fabra. Torres wrote her PhD on the nexus between EU external migration policies and the democratization of countries in Southern Mediterranean neighborhood. And she will speak more about Morocco, which was the case study in her PhD. But first out, Ottilia, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Hilda, and a special honor to be part of this discussion. As Hilda mentioned, we are having some electricity challenges which affect the network. So if for whatever reason you're unable to hear me, someone from the panel, if you can let me know, and then I will switch off my video. But I thought while I can switch it on, I will keep it on so that people know that they're not hearing from a ghost. What I'm going to be speaking about in just under 6 or so minutes are the overall trends, some of the challenges, and then possibilities in collaboration between Europe and Africa as it relates to migration issues. To do this efficiently, I've gathered my thoughts around some of the key conversations related to migration. Of course, there is a joint partnership between the African Union and the European Union that is meant to inform the overall partnership of the EU and the AU. However, as I'll speak on migration, and I'm sure my colleagues will expand on this as well, the point of departure between the African Union and individual African states and the European Union and individual European country as on migration differs. For the African continent, largely due to a history of labor migration, fueling economies across the continent, much of the emphasis has been on the potential for development that comes with migration. This is not to say that questions related to ethno-nationalism, xenophobia, and market protection don't arise within the African continent. In fact, as some of the cases in countries like South Africa, historically Nigeria, Cote d'Ivoire have shown, these are also points of concern. But contrary, or in a different light, for the European continent, much of the emphasis around migration policy, more over the past 7 years than before, has been focusing on security. What this means is that there's a clash, so to speak, around how do you go past the deadlock where African countries are trying to encourage migration, whether within the continent, which makes up the bulk of African migration, or out of the continent, vis-a-vis an increasingly securitized, short of border walls approach to migration, particularly fueled by those countries that do share a maritime border with the African continent. So you have two very divergent points of departure. But they are, and this is where I'm going to focus less on challenges, Hilda, if you will allow me, but on areas where collaboration can be an option and hasn't been explored as much. I am going to focus on 4 areas. The first relates to international protection. The second is on legal labor migration pathways. The third relates to legal and voluntary returns, readmissions, and reintegration. And then the final one, which I feel is perhaps one of the more important ones and an easy win, if this is possible, is around remittances. So first on international protection. While the majority of African states, as well as European states, are parties to the International Convention on Refugees, the way in which the response is applied is at national level. There's also been a conflation of those people that are voluntarily moving and those that still require international protection, but aren't necessarily asylum seekers nor refugees. I use the example of the current conflict in Ukraine to illustrate where Europe could do better. When the conflict in Ukraine erupted, immediately an effort towards international protection mechanisms that are not centered on a refugee regime process that allows for people fleeing the war in Ukraine to still be able to access protection, but potentially also to continue sustaining their livelihoods was adopted. I queried then, as I still do now, why such measures aren't necessarily in place for refugees, for example, from Syria, Afghanistan, in the Middle East, to those fleeing varying conflicts across the African continent as well. So I raise this because we know that the EU can do it. We know that it can do it in respect of its neighbors that are not part of the European Union. So there has to be clearer ways around processing of individuals within the international protection mechanisms. On legal labor migration pathways, there have been initiatives on a bilateral basis between individual countries, be it between Belgium or the UK and Nigeria in respect of nursing professionals, but it's focused on very specific sectors, and it's also largely been done on a bilateral basis. This presents a good opportunity from a broadening of perspectives point of view to actually encourage legal labor migration pathways between continents rather than between nations. It requires countries on the African continent to speak with each other around the labor needs internally on the African continent as well as externally. I say this, and I'll stress this again, over 80% of migration by Africans remains within the African continent. It means we can have a conversation about legal labor migration pathways with Europe, but we also need to be having that same conversation internally on the African continent, and then to present that to external partners. As I wrap up, Chair, because I know I've only got a minute left, I'll focus then on legal and voluntary returns, readmissions, and reintegration. To date, the focus has largely been on what I term forced voluntary returns. So it's only voluntary in that there is the individual themselves has no choice but to volunteer themselves for return, even though their preference would be to remain in the country. We know with deals such as that between the United Kingdom and Rwanda, also between Denmark and proposed between Denmark and Rwanda, that this idea of repatriating individuals to a third country is perhaps not the best way to deal with irregular migration. So how then do you encourage legal and voluntary returns? It is about internally, again, on the African continent, identifying countries where people may be willing to go to, not where you insist they go to. It's a different kind of matrix of arrangements, but the base of it has to be, one, that it is legal, and two, that it is voluntary. Because we have seen that where it is involuntary, you just create a revolving door. The same people returned still attempt their journey as well. The final point, and I'll end here, Chair, relates to remittances. At the moment, remittances outstrip income from foreign direct investment as well as development aid to a number of African countries. Countries such as Ghana, Egypt, Somalia, Zimbabwe are increasingly relying more on remittances as foreign income than they ever did on foreign direct investment and ODA. What this means is the best avenue, particularly for those European economies where African migrants find themselves, is to actually reduce the cost of remittances. Why do I say this? The majority of remittances do not go into the formal system and in fact follow channels where the cost is quite high, whether it's Western Union or MoneyGram or other alternative means to send money. But if it were more formalized and the cost of remittances were lower, then what Africa is seeking, which is to unlock the development potential of migration, is a viable option where remittances actually fuel economies rather than are a cost and burden to those sending them. Thank you very much, Hilda. I know you afforded me an extra minute.
Thank you, Ottilia. Mehari, go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Hilda, and thank you, Ottilia. I think I will follow what on the points that Ottilia has elaborated and eloquently, in my opinion. There are many ways to look at migration and migration cooperation in general. You could take the individual view that could elaborate sometimes from an individual perspective. The migrant is a big, important interest. The migrant as human being, the migrant as a bearer of human rights and others with responsibility to respect that human rights. And when we look at the days, the massacre in some cases, in the border area like that happened between Morocco and Spanish border, the days on the desert, days of individuals who could be rescued, or situations were made actually for them to almost die on the sea. When you see at that, the bigger picture, the human rights, humanity, that is one perspective we should look, the bigger picture. Of course, beyond that, there are interests of countries, states. The countries of destination have interest without question. They have rights on many aspects, but also obligations, like Ottilia was mentioning, rights to determine entry and exit at the state, but also obligations to allow and protect rights based on international law. And also countries of origin, they have concerns, aspirations for their migrants, but also for their population who are dependent on some of the migrants or the diaspora, like it was mentioned again by Ottilia on remittances and other aspects. You have countries of transit and that have interest. So these are a mix of interest, but I want to pinpoint on one area that I'm involved on in terms of research and publication is hopefully will come soon. And some aspect of that has been already published, is what works in partnership, on migration partnership between Africa and Europe in general, and why does it work? And some of them, I think Ottilia have mentioned. There are 4 factors that I have identified in my research. And these factors are nothing unique, but they help us to have a prism through which we can look at the partnerships on migration. The first one is there a shared priority on the partnership? The areas that it deals with, are they shared priorities? Are they convergence points in terms of policy? Where there is a shared priority, political support comes and other kind of issues come. But the first issue that comes in the partnership between AU and EU is where you have divergence in terms of priority, they fall off. They fall off. And there are examples for this. On legal pathways, it is a different priority. Africa has a priority. Africans want legal pathways to be expanded. For Europe, it is a very big concern. Sometimes it's a competence issue for the member states to deal with. And at EU level, there is no competence, but regardless of that, for Europe, for example, it doesn't become a priority. It's never to arrive. As I always say, it's like Godot, the Godot that never arrives, basically. Legal pathway is something that there is no shared priority on both sides. It is spoken, it's in the cliche, in the partnership, but it's never happened. The second one is the political support. And political support is important because it's the policy makers, the political entities that can apply and determine to implement. Political will comes with determination to implement it, both political decisions, resource allocation, and leadership. And on this kind of situation, it's so important that even political parties have tapped into this polarization of migration, because we are living under the politics of identity. Politics of identity has grasped the opportunity to use it for political mobilization on that. Not only in Europe, in Africa. For example, South Africa in some aspects belongs to Europe in terms of its migration policy. It doesn't belong to Africa in many ways. And it's been mobilized. It's used in politics of identity. So political support is critical. It's where it comes, implementation, it comes. And that where there is no impact on that, you don't have significant success. The third one is resource. Wherever you have significant resource in partnership area, it has moved. The partnership has worked. And I can give you examples. Okay, on political support, for example, shared identity, on free movement of persons, both Africa and Europe want. And there is resource allocated for that. And there is a chance, free movement within their own respective. So Europe supporting Africa's free movement protocols, which were, in terms of protocols, they were dead for 3 decades. And now they were resuscitated because money came from Europe. Europe was willing to do that. It helps in the terms of the containment strategy of Europe that people will move in Africa. It facilitates. So there is considerable resource there. But on other areas that are bad for Africa also, where there is money, there is impact. Frontex has taken some of the airports and some of the ports in Africa. It has moved south, and you have that impact. The last, and I know I'm taking time, Hilda, is implementation capability, especially on the African side. But also Europe has faced a lot of implementation problems. So the implementation capability of African continent is very important. Do they have the capability? And capability is a reflection of determination of leadership, but also priority. Why should migration be a priority for Africa while there are too many issues that takes a lot of resource? Priority determines resource allocation, budget allocation, usually. And Africa has many problems that are more acute than migration issue, if you wish, compared to others. And they will allocate more resource to that, then the capability is limited. And as the result, the pace of implementation is affected. And when implementation is not fast, or the pace that Europe wants, for example, when it comes to Africa, then there is frustration and fatigue on the partnership. So these are the things that I want for us to reflect further. Sorry that I took more minutes, but I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahadi. Luisa. You have to unmute.
Now, sorry. Hi. Thank you again for organizing this table and for basically for open this space for posing this question in such a straightforward manner. Something I think it's very relevant, but nevertheless quite rare to encounter these opportunities. So thank you again for counting with me for joining this conversation. So my contribution to this table today regards the question of what role do EU external migration policies play in the democratization processes in countries like Morocco. So basically, this was the question that has been the object of my doctoral research, which I defended last year. Just to give you a bit of a background, what brought me to pose this question is something that I believe that we all kind of share in this table, which is a nerd to go beyond this Eurocentric approach and analysis of EU external migration policies, and also a nerd to understand how these policies are affecting mainly the contexts and the populations where these policies are actually being implemented in the first place. So mainly in the countries of origin and transit of migration in regions like in Africa, Middle East, and so on. But mainly what has puzzled me the most, and what in my case was the lack of research and the lack of information on the impact of these policies to the internal political systems of those countries, including their processes of democratization or autocratization, which is striking for me in a certain way. If you take into consideration at least three facts. First, the fact that more than 80% of EU priority countries targeted by these policies are either autocracies or hybrid regimes, with a few that could be considered as flawed democracies, and that have most of them, or a considerable number of them, has a high level of political instability. Second, the fact that the externalization of immigration policies cannot be considered as a simple process of policy transfer, and as my colleagues have already mentioned, it's a process more close to a border gaming. So it involves a constant struggle for power, including incentives, mainly money incentives, but also leverage, a lot of bribery and blackmailing as well. And within this process, several geopolitical, diplomatic, and domestic variables also play a role. And third, but not less important, I think, the fact that the EU is a self-proclaimed normative power, has a self-proclaimed normative power identity, so has this general foreign policy commitment with the promotion of democratic values. So overall, for me, the fact that the EU external migration policy developed in such a complex, undemocratic, and even conflicted political context is not something that should be neglected or treated as a minor detail, and so it ought to be investigated. So this is what I have been trying to do in my work, which mainly focus on Morocco, and which is a country that, as you all know, has been cooperating with the EU for more than 25 years in the control of migration, especially in the border with Spain. So what I've tried to do is to summarize very briefly the main findings of my PhD research. So if you have any questions, we can continue to discuss in the Q&A session, and I think we'll tackle it somehow in the questions. So overall, what the analysis of the Moroccan case revealed was that the implementation of EU external migration policies vis-a-vis this country is very likely to be hampering the democratization process in this country. And I found at least mainly three hypotheses, three explanations to explain why this might be the case. So first, because such policies seem to hamper EU leverage towards Morocco in terms of democracy promotion. That is, it might be hampering both EU capacity and willingness to promote democracy in this country, mainly because these are two competing issues in EU foreign policy agenda. Second, because this process, this border gaming, seems to favor the maintenance of core social, political, and economic structures, and to reinforce the role of ruling elites in Morocco. So basically, the analysis revealed how Morocco ruling elites, in this case mainly the king and the Maxim, might end up being empowered by its cooperation on migration control, and how they might use these migration linkage to endure outside influence and even exert an inverted leverage. And use all of these as a tool for autocratic resilience. My research also identifies at least three types of concessions that are derived from these border gaming that seems to have been contributing, even if sometimes indirectly, to the empowerment of the Moroccan regime. First, you have what I call political and moral concessions, which comes mainly in the form of political recognition of the autocratic regime and its autonomy for Western Sahara. Second would be economic concessions, would be like in the form of monetary aid, financial incentives related or not to migration. And third, what is called material and logistic, which is more related with the provision of material, logistic, and capacity building support to Morocco. And in this case, mainly to their state and security apparatus. So basically what the first two would do would to reinforce the regime internal and external political legitimacy and control of their economy. And the last one would mainly reinforce the regime coercive state capacity, and most important, its capacity of its autocratic resilience. So basically what it looks like is that the actors that are being favored by this externalization process are mainly those who are less interested in prompting a regime change in the country, and might use this position, this advantage position, to maintain its position. But at the same time, the EU clear preference for ruling elites in the negotiation and implementation of EU external migration policy might also have the potential effect of disempowering the opposition elites. So a third explanation to why these policies affect democratization negatively is because they are also likely to disempower opposition elites. So mainly the civil society and other democratic forces and values that are the main ones fighting for democratic change in the country. And from the interviews that I did in the country, mainly with members from the civil society, they gave two explanations to why these democratic forces in Morocco might end up disempowered. On the one hand, they refer to the fact that the civil society is being broadly sidelined, having an increasing difficulty to access funds or even participate in the process of migration policymaking and implementation. Moreover, there's the fact that its members are being constantly persecuted by the authorities, which could also represent a great challenge for the work that they develop in the country. And on the other hand, stakeholders have also underlined the increasing deterioration of human rights in general and migrants' rights in the country. So overall, they consider that such policies would favor an already repressive, undemocratic, and corrupted context at the expense of migrants and human rights, at the expense of the work of NGOs and civil society organizations and the population as a whole. So basically, the argument that they make is that the instance of the Moroccan government that is taking a more humanitarian approach to the topic of migration is contradicted by what it's being actually done in the country. And also it contradicts the rhetoric of the EU, that it's focusing on the root causes of migration. And as Otilia had mentioned, it has been mainly a securitized approach to migration. So just to finalize, then apart from providing a broader understanding of policy impacts in the country, the analysis also allow us to understand a bit about the migration democratization nexus, mainly the fact that most local stakeholders would perceive also democracy, repression, human rights abuse as a key driver of migration in the country, especially if you consider among the youth and residents of certain regions of the country as the Rif region. So as a result, they also perceive democratization as a solution to the migration process, to the migration problem, as well as to many other problems in the country, such as human rights violation. So ultimately, what this would mean is that by strengthening autocratic forces in Morocco, the EU would not only be having a negative impact of the policies in the country, but would be even reinforcing the same drivers of migration that these policies supposedly intend to tackle, which is lack of democracy, good governance, and human rights. So the EU policies would not only be failing to address the deep structures drivers of migration, but could be likely even reinforcing it, risky to worsening rather than solving the migration challenge, at least in the long term.
Okay, I think I have to stop you there, Luisa.
Yeah, sorry.
We'll get back to you, of course. Katrina.
Okay, thank you, Hilda, for organizing this with the Fellows World of Africa and to my co-panelists. I'm already very engaged and looking forward to the debate. So I wanted to say a few words from Ghana here. So this is based on research that I'm doing in the project that Hilde mentioned, Effects, where we look upon the effects of European migration management policy in a number of countries in Africa and the Middle East, including Ghana. So a little disclaimer that to say that the fieldwork is still highly preliminary. So much of what we already know in the project is based on previous research and also a policy review from Ghana. So in view of Ghana's position as one of the relatively economically promising and politically stable countries in West Africa, the EU has collaborated with Ghana in managing migration within and from the ECOWAS region for quite some years, but with an increasing intensity since the 2015 Mediterranean crisis. But before jumping into the EU policies, I think it's important to start at the Ghanaian side, so saying a few words about migration in Ghana, which is highly multifaceted. And the national priorities on migration policies are therefore determined by this multi-directional flows, which spans from labor-induced to forced displacement. So the majority of immigrants in Ghana are labor immigrants, but it's also a host country of refugees. And in terms of emigration, Ghana is a major sending country with more than 1 million immigrants. So this is according to official statistics. So of course not saying the entire picture, but most of these immigrants live in West African countries, about 280, 300,000 in European countries and 200 in North America. So this is what shapes the migration governance picture in Ghana. And in Ghana, there is no one overarching agency that is mandated to coordinate all migration-related activities. So there are different government ministries, departments, and also agencies that are tasked with formulating policies and implementing these. And they then work on a number of different aspects that's related to migration. But the key actors include 8 ministries, 3 sub-ministerial bodies, and 2 offices at the president's office. So for instance, the people that work on diaspora affairs are currently situated in the presidential office, and then 3 autonomous institutions. But migration policy formulation, implementation, and day-to-day management of migration in Ghana is carried out through collaboration between these national bodies and international bodies, where EU is a major party because it funds a number of the more specific initiatives that are being implemented. But the EU is also one of the key funders when what is now the national migration policy was developed in Ghana. So this was spurred by both international and national recommendations. So the previous president, so the Mahama government, kicked off this process to develop an overarching policy framework to guide national migration governance. So, and as a result, there were 3 different policies developed in Ghana. One that is called the National Migration Policy, a second that is called the Diaspora Engagement Policy, and a third that is more focused on labor migration policy. But while there were institutional and policy developments in support of drafting these policies, less have been done to ensure implementation. Yet these 3 bullet policies now make up what has become the backdrop of Ghana's priorities on migration and concerns. So these were partly shaped by national bodies and subnational bodies, but also international actors like EU and also regional actors like the AU and ECOWAS. A potential lack of implementation of these policies is obviously related to funding, and many have called for a lack of continued funding that should oversee the implementation of these policies. And another alternative explanation is that there has been a political shift in seeing that these policies were developed or started to be developed under the former government. It may make it more difficult to implement it straightforward without going through them again by the current government. but also when to understand the EU's role in migration policy making and implementation.
Being recorded.
I think we lost Katrina there.
Yes,
Oh, there you are.
I'm back.
Go ahead.
I'll go a bit back. I guess you lost me a minute ago or so, but I just wanted to also mention briefly the regional migration policy relations that are highly relevant before discussing EU's role. So, so to contextual this Ghanaian migration governance and the effect of European interventions, it's important to recognize that the Ghana has done a lot to try to implement and to promote the AU migration policy framework, which provides guidelines to promote free movement, right? And the same with the ECOWAS free movement protocol. But there is also a mix in different aims within the Ghanaian government, seeing that the Ministry of Labour, for instance, is not as keen to implement the ECOWAS free mobility protocol, seeing that it could potentially hamper the labour market in Ghana and so on. But these are sort of ongoing discourses that's been in Ghana for decades, which is also then in the landscape of where EU is coming with some other external policy. So on EU collaboration, the relationship between Ghana and the EU has gone through several twists and turns over the last 20 years. So this is also in line with the changing migration landscape and what has been in focus for the two different counterparts. But since the early 2000s, so this is similar to what Utilia also mentioned, but specific cooperation has focused on, well, actually the facilitation of free movement and also more on this migration policy development, so the development of the national policies and so on. But then, of course, the control of irregular migration, specifically potential migration directed towards the EU, although it's not so much of it in Ghana. And finally, the promotion of return and reintegration. So I think what we can say is that the EU has been deeply involved in shaping the direction and the development of Ghana's migration policies and governance structures, seeing that in some issues there has been a difficulty in tracing down the relevant institution to collaborate with on a specific incentive. Thus, funding has been made for capacity building, for instance, to strengthen the institutions that were of and are of importance to the EU and European countries to collaborate on specific policy initiatives. And there's also been a very strong incentive in Ghana to make policies in accordance with European migration-related ambitions. So there has been some focus to and more in recent years to reduce irregularity and limit migration and mobility towards Europe and increase control measures. But I think an important potential overall trend in EU's focus on Ghana is that there, in the beginning of the 2000s, was more focus on the facilitation of free movement, to try to make ECOWAS protocol work. But after 2015 and so on, the focus has been overwhelmingly more on control and also on this capacity building and training of stakeholders that are involved in migration policy making and implementation in Ghana. So I think this is also potentially a sign of some decentralization of EU's migration collaboration in Ghana, seeing that it's not only the central government that is collaborating with the EU or European countries, but also more specific bodies and units, and also more directly with, for instance, border control centers away from the capital. So not only focusing on Accra, but also elsewhere. So I think I think I'll stop there, but there's so much to say on Ghana and EU collaboration, so I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you, Katrina. I see that now Ottilia is writing that the power is off, and unfortunately she has to leave. So I don't know if you're still there, Ottilia, but thank you so much for your presentations. And then I think we'll be discussing. Yeah.
Thank you,
so
Hilda.
much.
I'll see if I can connect on a mobile or something, but yeah.
You try that.
I will. And so if you do see me reconnecting, I will be on my
Being
mobile.
recorded.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, first, I just want to ask if any of you do you have any comments to the other panelists' presentations, or? Yeah, go ahead, Katrina.
So I just have to, if I may ask Mahari, because I was really interested in one of the comments that you made during your presentation, where you said that, so some of the, you speaking about these partnerships that doesn't necessarily work, but then you noted that the partnerships that do work are those that are most heavily funded, if I understood you correctly. But then I would also say that, so my experience from the Ghanaian case is that even though there's a lot of funding initially, the implementation it's not a one-off thing. You can tick the box and then it's done. In most of the cases, it's a prolonged process, and often it can be implemented, but then if the funding is gone, then everything stops. So I wanted to ask you if you have some more reflections on how you see your funding plays a role in making it work or not, or if, yeah.
Yeah, I think you have answered the point, the question, in my opinion. First of all, it's just the basics. Where there is no resource, the partnership area doesn't work. That's the point I was trying to make, because migration in general is not really a priority for Africans. If you were to look at the top 1 to 5 or 6 priorities for many African countries, it's not there. And for that reason, they would less likely to allocate budget. If you want to know where priority of a state lies, you go to the declaration of budget every year. You go, not what they say, they speak. Where they put their money is where the priority is. You go to the budget, you see, most African countries do not allocate as much on migration, especially for this kind of thing. Immigration issues maybe, but you wouldn't find a budget for. So the budget most often comes from partners or the capacity to do some things. And where there is money, actually the envelope and the activity does move. Even like I said, borders has been hardened because money was flowing even to wrong areas. Some informal cross-border areas that are known for informal cross-border movements have now seen strict requirement of documentation and check in some of the informal areas. Why? Frontex is moving, not Frontex in the sense the organ itself, the individual, but the working methodology has been moved. So this counters, for example, the work that Africans have been trying to do. First, to leave those informal crossings as is, because they didn't have capacity in the beginning. But now there is emphasis also on more free movement arrangements. So you have those challenges. But there are areas where funding was provided and they work. The African Remittance Institute, the migration policy framework that you talked about, which I was central in terms of developing 2005-2006, when I was the head of migration and partnership at the African Union. All this was not possible, wouldn't have been possible if there was no funding from Europe. The African Union would be less likely to allocate money for those because there are peace and security and other urgent matters. So where you don't have money and where you have high resource, for example, Pan-African universities, for example, some of the mobility for students happen under them, or free movement protocols, like I mentioned. There are areas that are identified where without money, they wouldn't move. Also, those areas that majority of money, for example, is allocated on migration management, which means it's a euphemism for border control, basically containing migration outside the country. So it hardens those kind of things. But you're right. That the second point, Hilda, while I'm here, I want to raise to Luisa point is that regime type is very important perspective, and I have written a little bit on that. The regime type always determines the partnership level, how effective it will be. Regimes that are authoritarian are the ones who are fast in signing agreements, and in most cases, especially for readmission agreement, return and readmission, because they try to impose it. And when you have a democratic system, it becomes very, very problematic because they have to answer or be responsive for the diaspora, which is concerned about return and readmission, and even for the families that are on the ground in the countries, because remittances will be affected. So it becomes a big issue how much responsive the regime is. So regime type has a big role, and I have written a little bit on that. I have shared some of the articles on the chat box. Thank you.
Luisa, do you want to comment?
Yes, it's very interesting perspective. Actually, Morocco, which is not like, I mean, it's not a closed authoritarian country, it still have some democratic institutions, and it actually has resisted, at least with the EU, to sign a readmission agreement, but it has signed bilaterally with other European countries, but it has actually used this maneuver that it has to as leverage for the European Union to try to negotiate on other sides. And I wanted to add on something that Hilde have mentioned, and also Otilia, all of you have mentioned somehow the idea of that African migration is not about migration towards Europe, and especially regular migration, because it's only a tiny part of it, but it's actually the part that the EU put a lot of focus on. And the problem, and especially like in my case, on my analysis, is not so much about the number, but more about the perception of that the EU has, and mainly like voters and the population in Europe has about this migration and its perception as being a threat that gives both the EU and also countries in Africa the capacity of working with these kind of arrangement and these partnerships, and giving power to bodies like Frontex, and that it has become somehow unproblematic, some of the deals that is made, and that it passes without, of course, there's a lot of it that is unknown, but it's more about these, right? About the perception of this threat rather than it actually being something real, right? Because of course the African migration within Africa is much more important, it's much more relevant, and it's not even something that is on the minds of African population as a whole that concerns them. They are concerned, as Maher told, about other things. But the point is of making the border, like the spectacle of the border, as something like being stormed, and that remains in the minds of people, and the media has a lot to do with that, internet and everything. There's a whole discussion on that, but you are right about these of the images that remains and how powerful they are in this sense.
Thank you. I want to ask all of you to give your reflection, kind of what is the incentives for African governments to collaborate and to kind of implement the EU migration policies? What's in it for them? Is it about increased funding for specific projects? Is it about increased aid? Or are there other kind of incentives that they have? And I would also like you all to reflect a bit about both the positive things that can come out of this collaboration, but also, Luisa, you have talked about these policy, how they can hamper democratic processes in a country. I also want you to reflect more about the negative consequences of this collaboration. Katrina, you can.
I can go.
Okay, yeah, Mahali, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one of the points I think is Lucia who has raised in his presentation is the factors in terms of what drives Africa's also migration policies in general. You will see what are the interests that African policymakers try to promote. And in short, I think there are few, about 6 of them that I identify. And one of them, for example, first of all, I mean, for many African countries, they see migration as a development issue. Unlike some of the literature, that development and migration are not necessarily inversely related. Actually, more development could be more mobility. But irregular mobility and so on, there are issues of capability and aspirations to be taken into consideration. But you will see also some countries are interested in the financial gains, foreign currency especially, and they want to use it also for diplomatic gains, like Morocco. Morocco is repositioning. It's a migration diplomacy. Some countries becoming the chair champion of this African-wide partnership with Europe. They want to gain more upper hand to become the interlocutor for many things. During Gaddafi, Libya were also using that. So they don't use, I mean, it becomes subservient of foreign policy tool. It will becomes a tool. So they use it to leverage. So there are financial gains, there are diplomatic gains, proximity also are very important in terms of addressing. But also there are interests to promote also Pan-African agendas like mobility, free movement within Africa. But ultimately, in most cases, especially on 2 areas, but on the third 2, on legal migration, legal pathways, and legal channels, and return and readmission, the risks are too high for politicians, especially if it's democratic. That means the risk will translate itself into voting rights and immediately affects the calculus of politicians. That's the reason why they are more responsive to return and readmission. You wouldn't say if they are democratic, they have a lot of problem in signing those kind of things easily. They have to sign it informally, clandestinely, or if it's about return of other nationals, not the nationals of the country. In most of the North African countries, it's about return of some other countries' nationals, which has less constituency impact on them. So the risks are too high. On border, also border control, its risk is high, but some countries do share those priority. They want to control their border. They don't have the capability. If they are provided with, even some countries like Sudan has requested helicopters from European for border control, for immigration, and so on. Niger was provided. So they want to have them, they want to put it under their purview because they don't have capacity that, and they want to use that money. So there are a little bit overlap there, even if it's not in the long-term interest of the nationals of that country, or even the Pan-African agenda is not about reinforcing colonial border. Actually, it was about how do you undo colonial border and move to integrative border in Africa. And there are policies already within the AU on integrative borders. So it affects those kind of relationship in general. But the risk in some cases is too high. That's the reason why they agree when they are in Brussels. But when they are back to their capital, they drag their feet. They don't implement it. And EU thinks that this will be implemented following the kind of discussion. Ultimately, it's power politics. It's a power asymmetry. They fear the European Union's repercussions from diplomatic and other areas because Europe is taking migration as the main basket for every egg it has. And it takes it with that and tries to sell that. And it becomes a power relations because they don't want to mess with powerful countries. And in the end, and power, I mean both diplomatic and other kind of power, financial power, and it becomes very difficult really to manage those kind of relationship. But it's a power asymmetry that you see.
Katrina or Luisa?
Maybe
he explained much better than me, so.
I also agree to what Mahari said, but I also wanted to underscore what you said, Mahari, that it really depends on the regime type, and of course this depends. So if it's a more authoritarian regime, the importance of legitimacy as an international actor, so the geopolitical importance here is crucial. But for a country that do not need the kind of international society's approval to such a high extent, so for instance, like Ghana, which is a more highly developed country and state with functioning ministerial bodies and functioning democracy, I think it's more about the need for funding. But of course, it's the power hierarchy is not making it a fair balance, I would say. So for instance, and in terms of the potential negative impacts, as you ask for, Hilde, I think that the dynamic nature and of migration in various regions in Africa is not correctly represented in EU's narrative of migration, I would say, seeing that there are some of these overarching partnership ideas and policy aims that are similar across very different contexts, and this shapes migration policies in these different countries, and that the policies that are then made misrepresent the complex realities on the ground, and this may have negative impacts on actual migration patterns in the regions too, seeing that the policies that are in place cater towards different types of mobilities that are happening. So for instance, this could be exemplified also, as Mahari said, that you have more informal, or what used to be more informal border crossings now have become more formalized in a way, which of course the idea of having more regular migration is an ideal, I would say, but in some context it is not. It wouldn't work, I think, because at the time being, irregularity is also an important part of social development in some of these contexts. So by enforcing a regular frame on more irregular movements may be also detrimental for families and communities that are dependent on international migration within the region. So I think
Lost her again.
Yeah. We'll just wait for her to come back. Luisa, did you have anything you wanted to say, or?
No, maybe I think Mahari explained very well about how migration diplomacy works, and that's basically what is taking place in Morocco. Let's Catherine finalize, and I think she's back.
Sorry, terrible internet connection.
Catherine, I
Yes.
may add, pastoralist community is the best example for your irregular movement, which is very important. So you could add on that, and yeah. Yeah,
thank you, and also like a different point, which I think, I don't know if you heard it or not, but we have to consider the post-colonial dependency, I think, and take it serious to see that these government actors, they do balance on a very fine line between EU interests and sub-local interests even, and they balance on that line both in terms of developing migration policies, but also then on what they implement, which I would think we should remember are two different parts of the puzzle in a way. So as you say, Mahari, in Brussels, they can agree to something and then they balance on that line in one way. But returning back home, the way they implement it is a different balancing act. Yeah.
I just want, this is a bit outside of what we're discussing now, but I just want to hear your reflections on something that has been discussed a lot in Norwegian media, in the UK, in Denmark. As you know, both the UK and Denmark have made some kind of deal with Rwanda. That Rwanda will be hosting asylum seekers applying for asylum to to those countries, which has also received a lot of backlash. I'm just wondering, what are your kind of reflections around such deals? Is it even possible to make something like that work? And what are the repercussions for the human right of fleeing and seeking asylum in also in European countries when you are from Africa?
I mean, if I can, this is something that I don't know this specific case. I haven't been following closely, but I know that Germany tried to do that with Morocco as well. So to consider Morocco as a third safe country. And this is also, from my perspective, something that could be considered as a concession for Morocco and some kind of reward in a certain way, because when you consider a country a safe place for refugees or for asylum seeker, you're basically saying that somehow that country is safe, or at least is safer than other countries. And so that it has not maybe big issues in terms of human rights, which is not the case of Morocco. So in the case of Morocco, to say that you were given like a concession saying, okay, you are safe, you are a safe country. So I think it's very dangerous, especially for people fleeing Morocco in the first place, like even Moroccan citizens, and not only people from other places that might find refuge in Morocco, because Morocco has also refugees and asylum seekers that want to leave Morocco. So I think it's very concerning and dangerous, and something that the countries in Africa might look for as a kind of exchange for, I don't know, for other kind of concessions, but at the same time is also a burden. Of course, for these countries, it can be because you, even like in the case of readmission or in the case of processing asylum seekers, without maybe having the capabilities or the resources for doing so. So I think it's problematic in so many ways. Maybe Mehari and Catherine has more perspectives on the countries that they know, but I only can think it's like very problematic.
Mehari, do you want to go next?
Yeah, well, first, Rwanda is different. It's unique. So it may be able to do this kind of thing and get away from that. First of all, the presidency is very, very strong. It could be explained with the regime type that we were talking. But also in Rwanda, not only Rwanda, but also in Uganda, also we have seen with readmission arrangements from Israel before. So I think it's not unique in a way that countries were returning and admitting individuals for processing purpose somewhere else, or even to live there. So it becomes more transactional on financial basis. Now, so the repercussion for Rwanda is not as such big deal, partly because you don't have robust democracy in the sense of accountability. The country is doing very well in the economic development front, but in terms of democratic accountability and so on, a lot remains to be achieved. Now, in Norway, that is not possible. The government will be under the purview of the people and constant. And Norway has even faced the same kind of situation for informal agreements that it has entered with Ethiopia, for example, at some point. So the issue ultimately becomes whether this is legal or not, whether this is human rights protective or not, whether it meets the standard that are provided under international law for this. And I think there are a little bit intricate legal arguments, but it's safe to say that this is part of the containment of creating a processing islands or black holes of human rights and processing accountability black holes in Africa, and then put them there. And it's nothing new. There were ideas of this kind about regional hubs for refugee process before disembarkation. It's different names that they are. At the heart is about legality, human rights of migrants in general, and their rights under international.
I think I don't have anything to add to what the two of you have said on this. I think we know it's highly problematic in many ways. But one thing I would, if I can take use the opportunity to ask another question to the two of you, and this has to do with the so the multi-level actors that potentially can be involved in migration policy collaboration with the EU. And so, for instance, in your case, Louisa, in Morocco, what is the room for non-state actors to be involved in steering? Not so much, I would assume, the conversations, right, and these policies that are actually being signed. But there must be some sort of reactions, right? So either from NGOs, civil society organizations, academics, maybe not the media, but yeah, do you have any, and what kind of role do they play in it?
I think in the case of Morocco, even if, as I said, formally, there's still, I think, because in Morocco, you know that you have a civil society that is like allowed, because you go to Morocco, you see a big civil society. It's not like other maybe very close authoritarian countries that you say like there's no civil society. Now there is, and it's even encouraged by the regime as political parties. So there is a bunch of democratic institutions, and the civil society is one of them. So there is this formal that it's allowed to play a role, even like informal agreements. But of course, these are not the most critic ones, or the ones that they're going to make noise. But I would say there is still in Morocco some room of maneuver and a thriving, because when there's space, and I think these things are still there. So I think there are important civil society movement and in academia as well, where they can and they actually do like play an important role, as you said, in the part of what is actually done and not what it's signed. Or so I wouldn't underestimate that. I haven't like done extensive work on the implementation on that side, but I really think, for example, if it were to in Morocco, the part of accountability, of course, it would be still worrying if we're taken to the side of the government. And with all, I don't know if you have followed closely, but I guess yes, but Morocco has been following an authoritarian trend. So it has become more authoritarian in the last years. And this has repercuted internally, like in the work of these organizations, in the work of these academics, which make their work like, so it depends on which subject you are working with. So, and the closer you are to the border. So it depends on, of course, if you're working on integration of migrants, or if you're working on some issues on human rights, it's going to be less problematic. But then if you're working close to the borders with the migrants that they care about, which are the ones that are supposedly waiting to cross to Europe, it's going to be a different treatment. But I think in Morocco, there is still some margin. In the case, for example, Morocco would be considered a safe country, and there would be there's some kind of accountability, even if it's for this civil society that is still there, or these other academics. So I think it's more vigilant and participative in this sense. And it's also related just because Morocco, as I think Mihari mentioned, it plays two roles. Morocco has one migration diplomacy with the EU and a totally different one with the African Union and with its neighbors, because it plays the European game with irregular migration because it's what it interests in that. But it's not because I think the government of Morocco is particularly against migrants or in pro of we want to stop regular migrations, just because, as Mihari said, is the basket that the only basket that the European Union works with. So they play there. But then in the African Union, they want to be like an example of migrant integration and all of the such. So it plays on these different teams. I don't know if it happens also in other African countries, if you have seen this pattern of double game.
Thank you.
Do you have any questions, Mahari, from Ethiopia? I'm just so curious.
Well, two things. First, I mean, the role of non-state actors is higher and more pronounced where you have the state actor. The role of non-state actors is more pronounced where you have weaker states, where you have even authoritarian regimes. That chance is limited for non-state actors. So in Libya, the non-state actors have bigger role than in other states, maybe Morocco, Algeria, or elsewhere. The states are more. That's the first. The second one, the role of agencies, development agencies, NGOs, companies on migration, implementing migration. If you see the UTF budget allocation, significant portion of the implementation is done either by UN agencies, which is increasing. It has shown increasing percentage, or it is done by organizations, companies, and organizations that have some expertise in this area, and they are working on some areas, especially on border control related area. Now, the cooperation is yet there. It's not that yet there, but the cooperation with private sector, for example, in some areas, especially for employment opportunity of refugees, local integration, which is an important component of containing secondary movement of migrants to other parts of the world, has become an important, and the private sector is significantly involved on those kind of initiatives. But it is more about in areas where you have spaces that are not adequately governed by the state, then you have more pronounced role for non-state actors, for example, in the Sahara Desert, in some of the areas in Niger and other Mauritania and Mali and those areas, you will have more pronounced role for networks, criminal networks, even who are working on smuggling and trafficking of people, but also smuggling and trafficking of illegal items.
I think we are coming towards the end. I haven't seen there isn't any questions from the audience, but I have a last question that I would like to ask. If you look at how we have talked about how the EU policies towards migration are now very much concentrated on securitization. In general, we are hearing this rhetoric of human smugglers. We have to avoid traffickers. It's to stop illegal and irregular migration, terrorism. This is kind of the general discourse about African migration to Europe. Do you think it is possible both to get better EU policies towards migration, but also to kind of create a shift in that narrative? How can we talk about migration? As you know, it's also a part of development. For African policymakers, migration is important in that aspect. Even in Norway, we wouldn't manage without migrants coming to work. So how is it possible to kind of, I want some positive thoughts and reflections going out of these discussions. Yeah, Luisa, you can go first.
Especially me, that I come from the darkest side of the table. I mean, I think it's an internal reflection. Of course, this discussion, and I work more in the Mediterranean area, and we always talk about that, right? How to create a Mediterranean narrative, an idea of like that we are all connected, and that migration is part of the history of the region, and it's part of the history of Africa and EU as well, and how to bring this narrative. As much as I think it should be a dialogue, and we should hear more and have these conversations of like African perspectives, and I'm not from Africa, so even like not even me, other people talking. I think Europe needs to take a very serious reflection on that. I think it starts from the foundations of where they want to go and how they want to be in the world, and a history of colonialism and racism that it's very deep. And only by doing this self-reflection, they can move forward to embracing and accepting something that doesn't need to be accepted, because it's natural and part of the world as it is migration is as old as human history, and it's not going to go anyway. And it's not part of because of migration, of climate change or anything like that. It's part of it. So I think that there is hope. And there's a lot to do also with how we portray it and our works as academics as well, because it's not only the media, we also have a lot of self-reflection work to do if we're not like reinforcing certain stereotypes. So I don't know, I don't think I have a ready solution, but reflection, a lot of reflection and conversations like that could put us in a better track maybe. But thank you again for listening and put everything, the opportunity to discuss it. I think it's very, very important. Thank you.
Katrina.
Yes, and just to add to that, I also think it's so this also depends on the political winds, right, in Europe and elsewhere. But now that nationalism is continuing to be on the rise, I think it won't change within the first decade, at least, unfortunately, in terms of the focus of externalization policies, focusing on hindering migration. But I think we also should be a bit motivated by looking a bit into the past. For instance, looking at EU's important role in facilitating the work on free movement in the African Union and ECOWAS and other regional organizations. So maybe also now, where we have much more research on the implications of EU's policy work in Africa, maybe that will lead to a higher focus on how infrastructures can be improved in terms of facilitating movement too. Because I agree with you, Louisa, of course, migration is an intrinsic part of development, right? So this is something that is being more, I think, included in migration policy making in the EU. So there's a positive twist in a darker landscape, I think.
Thank you. Mahalden.
Well, I have to agree. I think, first of all, we have to look for positive ones. We cannot afford to be pessimistic on in general. So I agree with you. There are areas to be happy in terms of win-win. And those areas that we are doing well, I think that in the partnership, they should be done more. For example, on remittances, there is understanding, there is a need for enforcement. It's win-win on both sides. It will help also in the long term, even in addressing development issue. Ottilia was mentioning that earlier. On free movement of persons, Africa wants that very desperately, and I think Africa has a lot to offer, and Europe has a pedigree on promoting free movement in the Schengen area, and I think it could guide both in terms of the spirit and also the financing. There is on diaspora, on also human rights issues. I think Europe, even if it's affected, its soul is affected. At least some people will be arguing it has lost its soul but on human rights, but it has a pedigree about human rights, governance, so it can contribute on this area as win-win. But there are, ultimately, I think Catherine has put her finger right on the most important point. This is about politics too. is identity politics, the worst form of politics, which is not open for debate, change, and so on. It's identity. And I think it will continue until that subsides somehow, the issue of migration and how institutions, even European institutions, which were to be insulated from this kind of identity politics, extremist politics, are even knee-jerk reaction. They have knee-jerk reaction on when they are pushed by national politics. So that is important, but ultimately it will be also about power relations and about resources. So I think Europe has many to offer. Africa has also many ways to benefit. It needs more listening to each other, and also trying to implement with a genuine partnership of some sort. That's what I can say. But thank you so much also for having me in this panel, Hilda, and thank you also for colleagues who joined us today.
Thank you very much, all of you. I think this has been a very interesting discussion. I've not even get to ask like 1/5 of the questions I had before this this event. So I think absolutely we are need for a follow-up in the future. But thank you to you, and thank you to everyone who listened to the discussions. And that's it. Fill out the form and then have a good evening.
Bye.
Thank
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.